So we find ourselves back on the road to winemaking enlightenment, and as a review, let's look at some of the pathogens or problem organisms that can occur in a winery and really give us some problems. We'll start with molds. Molds and mildews as well are pretty pervasive organisms, and by that I mean that they'll grow just about anywhere where they can, and their needs are pretty simple. If there's moisture and some organic matter for them to live on, they're basically happy and good to go for a long time. So in that respect, you can maybe look at mold as an indicator organism. So if you're seeing mold growth somewhere, that indicates that you probably have conditions which are favorable for other organisms as well. Areas in a winery that are especially prone to mold and mildew growth are surfaces like unfinished cinder block or concrete. And the reason for this is that if something gets splashed on it, for example wine or grape juice, then it will fill in the little pores, and even if it dries down, it'll become organic matter, which will provide good nutrient for the mold to grow. And also, because it is somewhat porous, it holds moisture very well. So if you have damp conditions and something spilled on a wall or a floor that's not protected, then it's very likely that you'll get mold or mildew growth there. Another area that's very susceptible and you see mold growing a lot is around drains where the slope isn't quite adequate to funnel the water into the drain. So if you have pooling water, it's a good place for something to start growing, and molds are one of the first things to start there. Of course, even if you have a well-finished wall or floor that's properly sealed or painted, if it's not kept clean, you can still get stuff growing. So it's important, even with materials like that, to keep them as clean as possible. Mold presents an unsightly appearance in any case when it's growing on surfaces in a winery, but it can also create problems in that it has odor and sometimes is a catalyst for creating other odors in the winery that can be actually very damaging to the wine and the environment itself in the winery. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, but I've experienced it in wineries where you go in and if they give you a tour of the cellar, I pay attention to what I'm smelling, and oftentimes, if there's like some really kind of off odors in the cellar, I'll find it in just about all the wines as well. So these chemicals, these odor-active chemicals, can be so odor-active, I guess to use a better phrase, or to use the best phrase, that they will actually transpire into the wine from the environment and actually give it an off flavor, an off odor in that way. And one very serious case of this can happen if you have wood or cardboard, so in other words wood fiber, and if mold comes in contact with that and is allowed to grow, and at the same time you have some chlorine uptake by the mold, and that can be from a chlorine sanitizer, which by the way you shouldn't be using, or even from chlorinated water, which if you can, avoid that as well. But also chlorine's pretty pervasive. It's in a lot of products. It's naturally occurring in the environment, and so you can have mold reacting with the chlorine or causing a reaction with the chlorine that produces TCA, or trichloroanisole, which is this incredibly odor-active chemical. Some report that it concentrations as low as 3 parts per trillion. So basically we're talking about molecules hitting you in the nose and you smelling them. It can be detected by some people, so it's we're very sensitive to it as humans, and it's kind of an off mushroomy nose. Some liken it to rotten potatoes also, although that's a bit extreme. But in any case, this odor is what is often referred to as cork taint. And so if you get a bottle of wine and it smells like someone dumped in a bunch of mushroom extract into it, this is TCA, and it's not something you want to mess around with. There have been wineries in California where they actually had to tear the winery down and rebuild it because they had a TCA problem in an old drain that had wood in it, and it reacted with some chlorine that was being used, and so it gave some pretty off odors. And it comes back to the fact that mold was involved in this, so mold then is actually more of a problem than just being unsightly. One thing that you can remember with mold or any other organism that's growing like this is one of the best plans of attack, we'll say, in terms of getting rid of it or keeping it away is just keep everything really clean. And so, if you have water that puddles on the floor, then when you're done washing, take a squeegee and squeegee it down the drain, or at least dry it up as best you can. If you have unpainted walls or ceilings or floors, it's best to seal them with some kind of a good solid paint that's going to hold up for a while and allow you to clean it off. And if you have wood or cardboard stored in the winery, move it out. Don't leave it left in there any longer than you have to. This is one of the biggest sources of molds, mildews, and off odors associated with them. So basically it comes back again to basic housekeeping. Keep it clean, keep it neat, keep everything out of the way that you don't need, and it'll make your life a whole lot easier. The next organisms that we can take a look at are yeast and bacteria. And it's again one of these interesting things where yeast and bacteria are vital in the winemaking process, and without them I guess we'd have to say we wouldn't have wine, because yeast are of course what creates fermentation. Bacteria also give us malolactic fermentation, which is a crucial part of much winemaking. So in one hand we look at these and we go, yes, we have to have them, and then we can also step back and say, well, but they're also spoilage organisms and they can cause us a lot of grief. One of the problems with yeast and bacteria is that they basically constitute a native population, not only in the winery itself, but also on the grapes and other raw material that comes into the winery. In other words, these guys are everywhere. So it creates even more challenge, I guess we can say, when it comes to controlling them, because it has to be an ongoing process. In other words, you can't clean something and then assume it's clean the next time you go to use it. So with this in mind, then, we have to look at what efforts are actually needed to control them. Microbial spoilage can have a rather profound effect on the wine, and the actual effects of it can be quite varied, as you can see here. It can alter wine flavors, so this could be the addition of new flavors, and Brett is probably one of the best examples of that, where the wine actually takes on a manure-like or Band-Aid character at its worst. It can also change the acid structure, and malolactic fermentation is a desirable effect of this. It can also happen in cases where you don't want it, in which case if you have a malolactic that happens spontaneously, it can reduce the acid to a point where it's no longer in balance with what you're trying to achieve. It can change alcohol content. There are some organisms that consume alcohol, ethanol, and in the process will use it up. It can be present in the surface film, which in some ways may not be too bad, but those yeast, the floor yeast especially, can contribute their own flavors, kind of that aldehyde nuttiness that one sees in cherries. And it can also act as a fermentative organism. Obviously, I mean, it is yeast and it's what we use yeast for, but in this case we're really talking about fermentations that occur when we don't want them. So perhaps after the wine is bottled, if we get contamination with some of the hardy yeast and they start fermenting, we can have some real problems. As I mentioned before, contamination can happen continuously with these types of organisms, and some of the sources that are pretty typical for contamination in the winery include the equipment that comes in from outside, and this can be something as simple as grape harvesting lugs or crates. It can be equipment that's stored outside. For example, if you have a large crusher stemmer and no place inside to keep it, and you bring it inside, the dirt on that and the dust can actually harbor quite a few different types of organisms that are basically spoilage organisms. Even something as like commonplace as dirty boots, and this is something that I see a lot in wineries, is where something gets spilled on the floor, like juice or wine, and it's not immediately cleaned up, and so what happens is people start walking through it. And now instead of having just a little spill, it's basically tracked all over the winery, and the potential for feeding all the undesirable organisms goes up in a big way. Also coming in from outside with mud on your boots. If you're walking through grape pumice or something like that, or even in the vineyard, or any place it's dirty, and you come in and the mud gets tracked around, you've now brought in outside organisms into the winery again, which hopefully was clean to begin with. Kind of an unusual but not uncommon way that wine gets contaminated is from other wines received from other wineries. So it's kind of common practice to bring in bulk wines, at least for some people, and these would be wines that are made by another winery and then are bought, in a drum load or a tanker load or however quantity, but basically they come into the winery in an unfinished condition, and at that point the winery who buys them can then finish them to their liking and use them in their own production. It's therefore important, if you are receiving bulk wines, to make sure that the source from which you get them maintains the high standards that you maintain in your own winery. If you have impeccable wines that have, basically always are very clean, and you keep the winery clean, and you bring in wine from an outside source that is not quite in the same condition, you can at that point import a whole bunch of spoilage organisms into your winery. As soon as you run the pump and the hoses, you've now contaminated those, which hopefully you'll clean afterward, but the contamination's still there. And so it can be a risky business at best to bring in these bulk wines. And to take this one step further, even concentrates, which are used sometimes for sweetening by winery, whether it be grape concentrates or other fruit concentrates, you would think would be fairly sterile and stable based on their source. But it's not unusual to have the Zygosaccharomyces yeast strain, or yeast species I should say, present in these, and they can tolerate high sulfur dioxide. They can tolerate the high sugars, usually around 65 or 67 Brix in concentrates. And when you bring them and introduce them into your wine, they are fermentative, and they'll start a fermentation. They're not even susceptible to sorbate that much, so basically once they get established, they can really wreak havoc in a winery. I remember hearing from a winemaker in a large winery in the Finger Lakes that one time he had brought in some concentrate to use as a sweetening agent for one of his wines. He pumped the concentrate into the tank in the appropriate rate of addition, and added wine to it, filtered it, bottled it, and at some point he started having problems down the road, and what he discovered was that tank was still contaminated, that he'd originally mixed the concentrate into with the Zygosaccharomyces yeast that came in on that concentrate, and it took him several really thorough cleanings to make sure he'd eliminated it all, because basically these yeast are so tenacious that it required only a small population to inoculate basically the whole tank. And so it was a recurring problem where he would use the tank for another wine, it would become contaminated, and it would start all over again with re-fermentations. So these types of situations you have to take seriously when you really think about what's coming into the winery, how is it going to affect my environment that I've created here, and how's it going to affect ultimately the quality of the wines. So as this incident with the spoilage yeast indicates, it's really crucial to make sure that you're aware first of all the potential areas in your winery where organisms can be sheltered, can find their little nooks and crannies to crawl into and hide, and ultimately eliminate those, or at least know what to do to keep them sanitary. And some examples that I have listed here are cooperage. Wood barrels are tremendous aids in winemaking. The effect that they have on wine that's aged in them really can't be duplicated successfully, in my mind, by other means. But yet you still have wood, which presents its own problems in terms of TCA production. And it also, the inside of barrels harbors a lot of bacteria and yeast. And if you have a wine that goes bad and the barrel's not cleaned, it will contaminate every subsequent batch of wine that's put into that barrel. So barrel maintenance is very critical, and making sure that the wines that go into the barrels that is very clean is also very critical. Even small things like rubber gaskets that on manways or in valves, if you have cracks in them, there's going to be stuff growing in those cracks. So maybe soaking these gaskets in sanitary solution is about the best way to eliminate that. I'm going to skip ball valves and come back to that because it's something that's very dear to my heart to speak about, and so I want to give it plenty of time. But rough surfaces on tanks kind of falls into the same category, and unclean surfaces, of course, present a problem in any case, so everything should be kept very clean and very sanitary. I'll return now to ball valves and explain a little bit about why I feel the way I do about them. Don't get me wrong, they're very useful, and they actually are indispensable in certain applications, but they do also pose some real problems and are an area that often gets overlooked when it comes to sanitation in the winery. So we can look at perhaps how a ball valve operates to get a little better understanding why I use this as an example. And if you look at the diagram, which is a cutaway, you'll see that in the center of it there's that silver ball that's been hollowed out to form the basic core of the ball valve, and it is that ball that pivots, and as it pivots it closes off the flow through the port. The challenge is that that ball rides in basically a cylinder, which means it's kind of like a round peg in a square hole. And if you can visualize that, you'll notice that there's gaps in the corners of the square part. And so looking at the side of the ball, you'll see that, or the side of the ball valve, you'll see that there is that square area that the round ball rides in. And what happens is when the ball valve is in use, there's liquid flowing through the bore of the ball, and when you go to shut it off, it basically just swings that little ball shut, and all the liquid that's in there gets trapped inside of the ball, and also it bleeds into that area around the ball. So now you have an area that's not accessible to normal cleaning, and will in fact harbor and not only harbor but actually propagate and encourage, it seems, the growth of all kinds of nasty smelling things in there. So the answer to dealing with this situation is basically when you're cleaning a ball valve, whether it's in place or or separated from the tank, the best thing is to open it part way. And what you're basically doing is opening the ball into that side cavity as well as into the bore of the valve itself. And when you flush your cleaning solution through, it will circulate and get into that area and clean out all the crud that's in there. Obviously this works best if you do it as soon as you're done. So as soon as you open the valve and are finished cleaning or finished emptying the tank or doing whatever, crack the valve halfway, flush it out good with your cleaning solution, and then I also always let it remain open if I'm not using it again in that half open position, so that air can circulate into that cavity around the ball and keep it dry. This will also help to keep things from growing, because most organisms, in fact probably all of the organisms that we're dealing with, require some form of moisture in order to survive. The next group of problem organisms that we need to take a look at are, of course, the insects. And in some ways these are the ones that are most noticeable. And if you've ever been in a winery in the fall during harvest, when there's a lot of activity going on, there's a lot of grapes around, a lot of juice, and it's actually, in truth, hard to keep up with the cleaning at that time, then you'll know that fruit flies tend to be pretty abundant and are extremely annoying. They fly around and they get up your nose, they get in your eyes, they get in your hair, they get in your mouth, they get in your food, they just get everywhere. And in some ways that's kind of the least of the problems. But some of the other insects that we look at, that we find in the winery, can also be problems. And so we'll take a look at those and exactly what their effect is on the winery and on sanitation. So one of the biggest problems with fruit flies, and in fact any other types of insects that crawl in and around grapes, and you'll see these quite a bit, is that they act as vectors. In other words, carriers of contaminants from one place to another. And you might think, well, we know what's the big deal here. We've got grape juice in one tank, we've got grape juice in another tank, it's grape juice on the floor. And how does this happen anyway? Well, basically what happens is when the fruit fly lands on a surface, It has its feet, of course, and it stands on its feet and it walks around, and it picks up these contaminants, so these organisms, whether it be mold spores, it could be fly larvae, it could be vinegar bacteria, it could be spoilage yeasts. It gets adhered to the pads on their feet. They then fly to the next place and they land, and if it happens to be on your tank of juice, and you've now inoculated your tank with at least a few spores of something which, given the right conditions, could grow into something very serious. And so for that respect, insects have can be very damaging. And then there's also this whole aesthetic thing, and it's really annoying to have fruit flies flying around. It's really annoying to have cockroaches running around as well, and we're dealing with the same thing here. They carry contamination, and they also just look really unappealing. So for that reason, we try to keep them in control as much as we can. Generally, control is very simple. Fly sprays can work. Keeping things really clean is probably the best way to keep fruit flies away. I mean, it's true if the door is open and you're actively processing, they're going to be flying around. But at the end of the day, if you can close everything up and spray them with, use a food grade spray in the plant, or some people have used ozone as a gas with some success, then that will help to keep the fruit fly and other insect population down. But again, the big thing is keep everything really clean. Don't feed them, and they tend to go away. There's also some insects that are kind of a nuisance in that they impart flavors just from their own bodies to the wine. And probably the best known example of this is the multicolored Asian lady beetle, which it looks like a little ladybug, and we think, oh, they're so cute and everything. And in fact, the USDA imported them into this country to help control aphids on maple trees, I believe it was, maple or oak trees in Kentucky. And of course, they're non-indigenous to the United States, so they have no natural enemies here. And they basically came in, took over, and they create quite a problem. Normally they're found in soybeans, and when they've harvested soybeans, which happens somewhere, kind of in the middle of harvest for at least us in this part of the country, they leave the soybean fields because there's no food for them there, and they go into other habitats. And quite often they'll find grapevines if they're close, and they'll get up underneath the canopy where they're nice and sheltered. They'll crawl in between the clusters, the berries on the cluster, and so they really kind of get hidden. And the problem with them is that when they become agitated, they ooze like this really kind of foul-smelling orange liquid out from their joints in their body. And if you get it on your hands, it actually will burn a little bit. And it also smells kind of like peanut butter or potatoes that are starting to go bad. Kind of along those lines. And they've estimated that it takes about 8 ladybugs in a 35-pound crate of grapes to create off odor. So in other words, it's a pretty serious problem. It does not take many of the little guys to do that. Another new insect that's just come on the scene as of recently, in fact this year it was a fairly big problem in certain parts of southeastern Pennsylvania, is the brown marmorated stink bug. And this one is, again, it has its origins in China, so it's another Asian one. It feeds on fruit, so it gets into the fruit, and it has what has been described as a crushed cilantro smell. Also, other descriptors that have been used are skunky or citrusy or even piney. And again, much like the multicolored Asian lady beetle, it only takes like 5 to 10 bugs per 35 pounds of grapes to have this off odor detected. So, while we think, well, insects are kind of nuisance when they fly around, and yeah, fruit flies carry things on their feet, there's also real issues with bugs and other insects getting into the actual fruit itself and contaminating it in a very real way in terms of odor. So insects then, not to be taken lightly and are best controlled as much as you can. Again, keep it clean, and do what you can to keep them from getting out of hand. The last group of organisms for this discussion will be basically the vertebrates. And so we're talking about birds, rodents, rats, mice, and so on, as well as raccoons. And you might think, well, I mean, birds you can understand. They build nests, especially if you have like an overhang, like a press pad with just a canopy over top of it. It's not unusual to have birds come in and start nesting in the spring when you're really not paying much attention to the area because it's used for harvest, which happens in the fall. But birds, of course, have a rather nasty habit of going to the bathroom just outside their nest. So if you have a nest up over a press, the first thing that they do when they leave the nest is they poop on the press. So this, of course, is, I think, pretty obvious, an unsanitary condition. Rodents, probably the same type of thing. They're scavengers. They'll crawl around. They're pretty indiscriminate about where they go to the bathroom as well. They will chew holes into sugar bags or any other ingredients that are laying around and basically just create a mess if they get a chance. They especially like bags of yeast. So if you have yeast carried over from prior year, make sure that you've put it into a plastic container that's rodent-proof. In some ways, raccoons are very much the same as rodents, and they're animals that we don't really want to have around the winery. Certainly not in it, and sometimes not even around it. They can do a lot of damage to a crop if they get in the vineyard, and then also around the winery, if you have grapes that you brought in the evening and are processing the next day. They can basically empty a 35-pound crate of grapes very quickly, and it's them because they don't eat the skins. So you'll see a pile of skins next to an empty crate. The raccoons have been there. They also, will nest in buildings and basically just make a mess of things, much like any kind of animal, wild animal, would inside of a building. So raccoons should be controlled as well. And one of the easiest ways of controlling just about all these types of animals is quite simple, and that's just keep what we call a clean zone around the building. So if you have tall brush up against the back of your building, you might think, well, no one will see it, what's the problem? But it provides perfect habitat for some of these animals to live. The best thing is just keep it mowed, keep it cleared away. You'll have less problems if they're less likely to find a place to live. And you can also put rodent traps around the perimeter of the building, which will help prevent them from coming in and making a mess of things. So, they're big, which is nice. You can see them, and a little bit better than dealing with some of the other small microbes that we've talked about so far. But nonetheless, they do create problems and have to be dealt with appropriately.